All right, so good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to all of those who are here in person, and good whatever time it is for those of you who are joining us online. So I'm very happy to welcome today our speaker, Elijah Siegler, who's going to be presenting on how Daoism became American. So Elijah Siegler is a professor of religious studies at the College of Charleston, South Carolina, United States. He's a specialist in American religion and American popular culture. And primarily, or his original and continuing research is on the history of American Daoism. So that's what he is currently finishing a book about. And Elijah and I were the co-authors of the book Dream Trippers, Global Daoism and the Predicament of Modern Spirituality, which was published in 2017 in Chinese, 梦到华山全球道教与现代灵性的困境. So actually, at the end of this talk, there will be a QR code for downloading the open access version of the Chinese translation of that book. But Elijah has also published on new religious movements and other aspects of religion and American popular culture. So today, he's going to give us the talk on the tale of translation, conservation, immigration, appropriation, and impersonation. So, Elijah.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stand up to have a little more energy, walk around. Can everyone on Zoom see and hear me? Like this. Thank you for being here in person. Thank you for being here on Zoom. Thanks to the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences for sponsoring this talk and advertising it. Thanks to Professor Palmer. I don't know him that well. We just met. Here's a nice guy. Yeah, we're old friends. We're very, very old friends. So I'm going to talk today for maybe 45 minutes. And then that leaves us a lot of time, as much time as we want to talk, to have a discussion, because that's really, where I think the interest comes out. I really I'd love to have a high, I teach at an undergraduate college in the United States, so I'm used to, I'm always trying to encourage student participation. So even when I'm giving a lecture like this, I want to encourage participation from everybody. So, please take note, think about whatever kind of questions, comments, disagreements you may have. And I actually want to start by asking you two questions that just keep in the back of your head as I talk. I'm not going to be answering these questions or addressing them directly over the next 45 minutes, but they hopefully will inform the bigger issues of this discussion. So kind of just feel free to think about these questions and then to maybe even answer them when I'm done with the talk. And these two questions are this. Number one, how much can something change before it becomes something else? How much can something change before it becomes something else? You can look at that. I look at that through the lens of religious studies, but you can look at that through the lens of philosophy or sociology or science if you want. And then the second question is, who decides what is authentic or not? Who decides what is authentic or not? So those are the two guiding questions for this talk today, which, as you can see, is called How Daoism Became American, a tale of translation, conservation, immigration, appropriation, and impersonation. Don't worry if you don't quite understand how all these words fit together. I don't really understand that myself. I might not even get to all those words, but I like a big long title with lots of internal rhyme. So that's where we're going. So then the question is, so if this is about American Daoism, then the question is, well, what is American Daoism? So here's the kind of standard definition of American Daoism that I came up with myself. I wrote it, right? So you can do it. Let's dig in there and criticize it, but it's kind of the standard definition. A new American religion, it promotes self-improvement, physical, mental, spiritual health by offering a series of modular voluntary practices with both produced and unproduced by an overall Daoist worldview. Blah, 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 blah. You can read that, write it, take it down, argue with it, whatever. But so then, if that is our working definition of American Daoism as formulated by me, because I'm really one of the only people that study American Daoism. I've always wanted more people to get in and study it, but not that many people, and more people are. Then the question is why does this look so different from traditional Taoism as practiced in China, right? Which again is not one thing; it's a big, wide field. But when I teach Introduction to Taoism to my students in South Carolina, I kind of emphasize, that what the Taoist tradition is very complicated, right? The Taoist tradition, as we were discussing at lunch, is often seen as the indigenous religion of China. That's one good definition. I tell my students that Taoism has a 2,500-year history at least. And like any other major religious tradition, like Christianity or Buddhism or Judaism, it's gone through many different changes, many different divisions over the years. It's not just one thing. And a lot of my students don't necessarily understand that Taoism has a very strong moral and ritual dimension, right? It's not just a philosophy, it's not just an attitude, it's not just qi or yin yang sign or whatever. It's got a lot of moral teachings, and it's got a lot of liturgy to it. Okay, so obviously there's a lot more to that, but that's kind of the start of how I want to explain the Taoist tradition to my students. Another thing I tell my students, which most of them are pretty shocked at, is that Taoism has many divinities within it, right? And again, contrast that with American Taoism as I defined it to you, right? So it's got the Sanqing, the three pure ones, right, that are sometimes seen as emanations of the Tao, different personifications of it. You can see those enshrined in many Taoist temples in mainland China. Largest after Buddhism. And again, I'm here with David Palmer and maybe some other experts in Taoism. So please, okay, should I move a little bit? So please, David, please correct me. Or just after Buddhism. And this corpus includes precepts, which moral teachings, right? Commentaries on text, talismans, and more. Right. So it gives you an idea of the rich, complicated tradition. Another thing I think that's important that I like to tell my students in Charleston is that Taoism in some ways has been in decline for quite a while. At least for the last millennium, Taoism has been neither really expanded much, nor has it had like an active congregation. It's almost been a priest, at least as it's expressed in China. It's been, the people that call themselves identify as Daoists, mostly Daoshi, and this may be changing recently, but, for maybe the last 1,000 years, the people that identify themselves as Daoists, that word really implies a kind of initiated position, right? So a monk or a priest. So that's different from Western religions, when anybody who, is baptized can consider themselves Christian, and who goes to church, right, can be a Christian. And especially for the last 200 years, Taoism has been misrepresented by, it's been really in decline. It's been misrepresented by Confucians, by Christians. Really, the 20th century has been a disaster for Taoists, right? A catastrophe. Christians called it superstitious. Chinese modernizers called it superstitious. Japanese soldiers invaded Taoist temples and Taoist monasteries. The communists, saw Taoism as kind of a nationalist stronghold. And then during the today, Taoism on the one hand, guys, can you on Zoom hear me now? So today, Taoism in China, on the one hand, is dealing with communist bureaucracy, and on the other hand, with the dictates of kind of consumer capitalism, right? So if you've been to Taoist sites in China, you've kind of witnessed both of those things. I would generally tell my students that Taoism is the most misunderstood of all the major religions of the world. And let's just leave it at there for now. If people want a good one-volume introduction to Taoism, I might suggest some books by Livia Cohn. These are introductory textbooks by Livia Cohn, or by her student Louis Komiathi, or her other student James Miller. And these are just kind of broad overview, kind of undergraduate textbooks that give a good overview of Taoism. So compare that to what I said earlier about American Taoism, and you'll see there's a really big disjunction. So if American Taoism doesn't have much to do with what I've just been talking about, the divinities of Taoism, the rituals, the scriptures, then where does American Taoism come from? Okay, that's the question. So one way to think about how American Taoism arose is from kind of a theoretical perspective, right? Kind of the theory behind understanding American Taoism. And one theorist that I found very useful, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on him, but just to give you an idea, I think this is going to be helpful for the rest of my talk. One theorist is Edward Said. This is his famous book from, I think, 1979 called Orientalism. Edward Said was a Palestinian-American scholar who taught for many years at Columbia University in New York. He was a scholar of literature. He wrote books on British literature and so forth. But his most famous work is called Orientalism, where he takes that sort of venerable term, like the study of Asia, and kind of turned it, he kind of defined it as kind of the study of the East from Western scholars and the political uses that they put it to. And he's really one of the originators of like post-colonial thinking, right? The study of colonialism. And he didn't write anything about Taoism at all, but I still find his analysis very, very useful, right? Because I argue that American Taoism is really notable for its Orientalist character. Clicker stuff.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, that's okay. Okay. So this is using Said's own language. How he said that the first step in the Western construction of the East was constructing the West and East as polar opposites, as binaries, which of course is ridiculous because we live on a globe. You can't divide the globe into East and West, right? There is no real East and West. Where would you put that line? But that's what Western scholars have done and continue to do. And according to Said, scholars, and he was mainly talking about 19th century anthropologists of the Middle East, of Islam. That's what this book. But this focus as well on South Asia, on East Asia, on China. So the Orient to these scholars was irrational, depraved, childlike, different, and therefore the West was constructed as rational, virtuous, mature, and normal. This is what Said said that these Orientalist scholars did. But I think equally important, and indeed more important for my argument about American Taoism, is what you might call romantic Orientalism, which also constructs a binary between East and West. But in this case, the East, the Orient, is seen as much more positive, as spiritual and mystical and timeless. And the West is seen as, whether Western religion or Western science is seen as being judgmental, dogmatic, mechanistic, and dualistic, right? And you're going to see this come up a lot in American Taoism. I'll give you some specific examples later, but I'm sure you can think of some yourself. All right, come on in. So according to Said, the steps of Orientalism, it's kind of a three-step process, right? And the first step we already talked about, bifurcating, dividing the world into the East and the West, and never the twain shall meet, according to Kipling's poem, right? And again, you can see how that's just kind of nonsensical on its face. The second step, according to Said, was historicization. And that's where any good qualities of the East, and again, he was talking more about the Middle East, but I think this applies well to scholarship and popular Western ideas about China and about Taoism. Any good qualities are found only in history. They're found in the ancient time immemorial. And the current present day East is seen as corrupt, evil, stagnant, backwards, etc. All these negative stereotypes. Okay. And then the third phase, and we're going to be talking about this a lot later, is conservation. And that's where it is then the job of the Orientalist, the job of the Western scholar, to conserve whatever is good about the East, to conserve the ancient wisdom, let's say, the mystical teachings of the East. It's up to us Americans. I'm an American, so I'll just say Americans are us. It's up to us Americans to conserve the East. So this is what, even though Said was mostly talking about Europeans, right? This is Said's step of Orientalism. Okay. So keep that in mind as we discover a little bit about American Taoism. So one more theorist I want to talk about, and this is a friend of mine, a woman who has wrote a very important article that really takes Said and really extends it to the realm of American popular culture, right? And that's my friend Jane Uemura, who wrote a very important article many years ago that I teach all the time. I teach it as often as I can. It's called The Oriental Monk in American Popular Culture, and it's in the volume, the third edition of Religion and Popular Culture in America. I also have a chapter in there unrelated to Taoism or Orientalism on religious symbolism and Eliade in a kids' cartoon show called Adventure Time. Do you have any Adventure Time fans out here? It was on the Cartoon Network. Anyway, forget about that. So what did Jane Uemura talk about? She took that idea of Orientalism and she showed how these Orientalist ideas constructed a kind of popular culture image of the Oriental monk in American movies and American TV shows. And sometimes she used real life examples like actual Asian monks, like the Dalai Lama and his kind of pop culture relevance. But then she also used a lot of movies and TV shows, fictional people that, including characters from, for example, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Do we have any Ninja Turtle fans here? All right, good. And a few others that I'll get to in a second. Okay. And she argued that in this popular culture, these Oriental monks, like Said's theory, represented a kind of binary opposition to Western culture, and that they were also historicized. In other words, they were seen as being kind of elements of the past. Then I think her most brilliant insight was how she applied this stereotype of the Oriental monk to how she applied the third step, conservation, to the stereotype of the Oriental monk. And we'll come back to that in a sec, so keep your eyes open for that. But let's move away from cultural theory for a while. Let's move away from Said, because really I'm trained as a historian of American religion. So let's talk about American history. So if we were to try to find a historical starting point for American Taoism, right? Keeping all this kind of in the back of our head, where would we look? Where's a historical starting point for American Taoism? Looking through American religious history. So one place, this might be the logical beginning we might look, is in Chinese immigration to America, right? Which is something that is a very rich subject, something I love teaching about. The first Chinese communities in America came to San Francisco, known as Jinshan, Gold Mountain, because of rumors of the gold rush. Some of you may know that. And very quickly, they set up temples in San Francisco, but also in little towns throughout rural California, and even all across the American Mountain West, because, as you may know, many Chinese laborers were employed constructing the Intercontinental Railway in the US in the 1850s and 60s. So there used to be Chinese temples in small towns in Oregon and Montana. Those are all now gone, or sometimes they're museums. But it's quite an interesting and fascinating history. But is it the beginning of Taoism in America? Well, I don't think those Chinese temples, and here's an example here, a photo from 1887. Those Chinese temples were really popular temples, folk temples that combined Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, kind of like self, sort of protective agent. And I don't think they consider themselves to be Taoist. Maybe now they would. Yesterday, David and I visited Wang Daixin, which is also kind of a popular Chinese temple that does sort of present a Taoist identity. But I think in 19th century America, being a Taoist temple really wasn't on their mind. They were really and also I don't think that the contemporary like magazines and newspapers, people who wrote about the temples at the time, saw themselves as Taoist. And also, like from today's scholarly perspective, they wouldn't really be considered Taoist either. So I don't think you can really see this as the origin of Taoism in America, right? It's definitely the origin of Chinese religion in America, but that's different from Taoism. So that's a really important field of research, but kind of a dead end, at least from my perspective. Okay. Or at least not where I want to choose to cite it. Another place that people who know a lot about religion in America may think about the beginnings of Taoism in America is this really important event in the history of American religious history, something that I teach about all the time. This is called the World's Parliament of Religions. took place in Chicago in 1893 as part of a World's Exposition. And it was really the beginning of the modern interfaith movement. And I know Chinese emperors had kind of interfaith debates, in ancient times. But in terms of modern interfaith dialogue, it started here. And you can see this famous picture. These are people representing various branches of Christianity. There's a rabbi there. There's there's several Buddhists from Sri Lanka, from Japan. The first Hindu missionary came to Chicago, Vivekananda, to preach Hinduism. There's one Chinese gentleman right here. Let's see if I can get the pointer. There he is. This guy there. Kind of a heavy guy. He was actually the Chinese delegate from Washington, D.C. So he was a delegate of the Qing dynasty to the U.S. government, and he represented kind of, I guess, Chinese religion in general. Pu Kuan-yu was his name. And Daoism, there at the beginning of this Congress, which lasted about 2 weeks, and people of different religions gave speeches. Of course, the person in charge of it was a Protestant minister, and his not so secret desire was that all these different religions would come together and realize that Protestantism was the best religion, right? But still, it was a great event, and it had a lot of impact on the history of Asian religions in America, Buddhism in America, Hinduism in America. What about Taoism in America? Well, at the beginning of this World's Parliament, a great bell was sounded 10 times to represent the 10 great religions of the world, which of course is kind of a construct, right? And so Taoism was one of those 10 religions that represented by a bell. But who on this platform of religious leaders spoke for Taoism? Nobody. Taoism was represented by an anonymous essay, right? We still don't know who wrote it. It might be this guy here, actually. It might be the Confucian, because the essay itself was very historicized Taoism. It said, Taoism used to be a great tradition, but it slipped mightily, and it needs to be saved from errors, right? That was a close paraphrase of what was said. So Pu Kuan-yu, as the Qing dynasty government represented Confucianism. Taoism was represented by an anonymous essay, and maybe that's very Taoist in nature, kind of Wu Ming, right? No name, right? So, okay, that kind of works. But it's kind of significant that there were a lot of Buddhists there, a lot of Hindus, one Confucian, no Taoists. And the essay representing Taoism basically criticized modern Taoism and just valorized ancient Taoism. So it didn't really come into anything. So I don't think that's really the beginning of American Taoism, right? It's definitely one of the beginnings of American Buddhism, probably the beginning of American Hinduism, because of Vivekananda, the Hindu monk from India, who after the conference stayed in America for many years, founded the Vedanta Society in many different cities in America and so forth. Nothing like that. The equivalent did not happen in Taoism at all. So, what is our historical moment that begins American Taoism? At least that as I choose to present it, right? This is just my theories here. It could be wrong. I think, to me, you need to focus on writers and scholars. Yay, scholars! Woo! Right? We're important, right? You have scholars, and then who bring to light new information on Chinese religion, right? But again, from their kind of through their Orientalist lens. And they really helped construct a romantic picture of Taoism. Taoism that might cure the illnesses of the modern West, right? And here we come to sort of the essence of what American Taoism is today. American Taoism will help cure socially and physically and spiritually the ailments of the modern West, right? And through some of these more scholarly writers, then you have popular writers, and then it comes out to kind of the general population at all. So let me give you a few examples. I could list 10 or 20 different writers who really kind of originated American Taoism, but I'm going to focus on just 2 or 3, I think, important ones. But there are others as well. So here's a guy probably most of you have heard of, Carl Jung, the famous psychologist, right? Former colleague of Freud. Jung is famous for his concepts of archetypes and anima and animus and other aspects of psychology that have become popular in modern day spirituality. He was also very enthralled with Chinese religion, Chinese mysticism, and particularly Taoism. He wrote a preface to an English originally a German, then turned into English translation of the I Ching. the Chinese Book of Changes, which, as I'm sure you all know, is not a particularly Taoist book. I mean, it's just as Confucian as Taoist, but it became part of kind of American Taoism. And he also wrote, as you can see here, a commentary on a Qing dynasty alchemical Taoist text that became one of the first books of Neidan, of inner alchemy, translated into Chinese, right?
Into English.
I mean, into English, right? From Chinese into English. So he's really one of the people most responsible for popularizing Chinese alchemy in the West. Another influential author that romanticized Taoism, probably less known than Carl Jung, is a man named John Blofeld. I'll show you a picture of him later. That's not him. That's a monk on Huashan. But John Blofeld, unlike Carl Jung, actually spent many years in China and knew China very, very well, and really, wrote some beautiful descriptions of China. And so I'm not here just like to criticize these guys. I mean, Carl Jung is obviously an important psychologist, a brilliant thinker. But they do provide this kind of romantic view of Taoism that causes American Taoism. So John Blofeld was a British writer and explorer. He was one of the first people to bring Chinese Buddhism and Taoism to a mainstream Western audience. And he wrote at least two major works on Taoism in English. One is called The Secret and Sublime, Taoist Mysteries and Magic, and kind of getting the idea of the romanticization of Taoism. And the other is called Taoism, The Road to Immortality. And these were written in the 1970s, and he called Taoism the progenitor of the world's first hippies, unquote, right? And he kind of nostalgically reconstructs his visits to Taoist temples he made when he was living in China in the 1930s. He has these kind of romantic ideas of climbing up Huashan, which is a climb that David and I have done before. But his tone was somewhat patronizing. And let me just give you the opening sentence of his book about Taoism. Quote, Taoism, ancient, mysterious, charmingly poetic, born amidst the shining mists that shroud civilization's earliest beginnings, right? So that kind of goes on from there. And of course, in his books on Taoism, he focused mainly on classical Taoist philosophy like Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. He talked a little bit about alchemy, and very, very little about Taoism as an organized religion, even though he visited, monasteries in China and Beijing and on Huashan and so forth. And I did want to include a picture that he didn't take. It was actually taken by a German photographer and explorer, Hedda Morrison, who took some wonderful pictures of monks in Huashan in the 30s and 40s. Let me give you one quick more literary influence, and let me move on. So this guy, I don't have a picture of him because he's kind of reclusive, but this is a very famous book, The Dao of Pooh. First came out in 1982, written by Benjamin Hoff. Benjamin Hoff undoubtedly read Jung and read Blofeld, and then turned that into a very popular book, a kind of perennial bestseller, where he tries to explain the principles of Taoism through the characters of Winnie the Pooh, right? And Tigger and Eeyore, and scholars of Taoism, people like Terry Kleeman or whatever, just hate this book so much because they say it totally perverts Taoism. I criticize it mostly because it perverts Winnie the Pooh. Right? I take Winnie the Pooh very seriously, and I think it misrepresents Winnie the Pooh. But this was a book that, for many, many years, any Westerner, any young American who was interested in Taoism would have read this book. And I would tell people, when I was doing my dissertation research many years ago in the late 90s, early 2000s, I told people I was doing my dissertation research on Taoism. Like, I have this great book for you. It's called The Dao of Pooh. Have you read it? It's like, yeah, of course I've read it. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of writing, I'm criticizing it in my dissertation. I think these days, fewer and fewer, at least my students now, haven't read Dao of Pooh, which is actually an advantage because when I teach them Taoism, I don't have to unlearn them Winnie the Pooh first. They kind of come in as a complete blank slate. They don't know anything about Taoism, which is actually a good starting place. But I think for many years, students of Taoism really thought that this book explained everything there is to know about Taoism. And one of the hallmarks of this book is it makes the claim that Taoists are completely unlettered. Daoists never read or write anything, which of course is crazy because remember what I told you before, Daoists have the Daoist canon, the Daozong. I mean, it's the largest canon. Daoists are constantly reading scripture, chanting scripture, getting revealed scripture. And yet, if you read the Dao of Pooh, you'll say that, oh, it's those Confucians who do all the writing. And, Daoists are, the book learning is very un-Daoist, right? So let me switch now from literary influences to pop culture influences. And here we're going to dip back into kind of Jane Uemura's theory of the Oriental monk and pop culture. So this is a slide that was prepared by our friend Louis Comyathi, and I'm using this slide. I've modified it a bit, this slide and the next four with his permission. Lewis is another student of American Daoism. You may recognize these figures here. Master Poe is from the 1970s. These are all from American popular culture, right? This is all American popular culture. And the first is a TV show. The second two are from the Star Wars universe, and the third, of course, is from the Karate Kid, right? Jane Uemura writes about all these characters in her essay, so I recommend you read that on your own. And these are kind of like in my field research, when I spent many years interviewing Americans who identified as Daoist or who were very sympathetic to Daoism, right? And when I asked them, how did you first encounter Daoism, or how did you first get interested in Daoist ideas? Some of them would say, oh, I read the Tao Te Ching in college, right? But many of them would say, depending on their age, I watched Kung Fu at home, right? Kung Fu is the story of Master Cain, a half Chinese, half American martial arts master who wanders the American West in the 1880s, but who is taught by the wise Master Po. And if any of you know that expression, grasshopper, like calling somebody grasshopper, it comes from that show. So that meme or whatever of like a wise Oriental monk saying, grasshopper, it's Master Po teaching Cain. People got interested in Yoda and Obi-Wan Kenobi using the Force, the Jedis. There's something very Daoist about that. And indeed, George Lucas was influenced by kind of popular ideas of Daoism, like Yeoman Blofeld. And of course, Mr. Miyagi, although he was Japanese and he taught karate, represented a kind of Oriental monk wisdom, right? And so this Oriental monk wisdom, you can see here is a quote from each of the four kind of Oriental monk figures. These all kind of sound like Taoist quotes to you, don't they? They all kind of sound like they could be from the Tao Te Ching. They're not. They're written by American TV writers, right? And film writers, which is great. You love it. But this is kind of what gets people interested in what they think Taoism is in America, right? This is how they come to Taoism. So here's where it gets really interesting. Remember, I was talking about Jane Uemura's article, and I said she talks about this Oriental monk character and how this Oriental monk is seen as like bifurcated and also using Said and also historicized. What about the conservation? Well, Uemura not only analyzes the Oriental monk in American popular culture, but she also says that these narratives, these TV shows and movies also deal with, there's another figure in there. There's the figure that basically inherits the wisdom of the Oriental monk, but then activates it for the modern West, kind of learns mastery, learns to, this ancient wisdom, learns martial arts techniques or meditation or magic, but actually brings it to life by being a young, powerful Westerner, right? Or a hybrid figure. And this is a character that Jane Uemura identifies as the bridge figure. This is what she comes up with the bridge figure. So as I told you before, Cain, who's the hero of Kung Fu, Master Po, you just see in flashbacks in the TV show, he's half Chinese, half white, and he kind of embodies, he's learned everything he can from the ancient East, but then he goes to America and he kicks butt if he has to. He doesn't like to use violence, but if he has to, he'll kick your ass, right? Because he knows all the ancient meditation techniques. Luke Skywalker, of course, and these are often orphan figures, like Cain is an orphan, so is Skywalker. Daniel LaRusso is the product of a broken home. And they somehow kind of embody the wisdom of the East, but then the action of the West, right? So they're bridge figures. And Bruce Lee, I think, really saw himself as a bridge figure. Born in America, moved to Hong Kong. He has he has Asian background and also Western. parentage and so forth, taught martial arts mostly to Westerners in LA and so forth. And so she analyzes him too. So what does this have to do with actual people on the ground? These are pop culture figures. I would argue, and this is my argument, that a lot of American Daoists want to be the bridge figure. They become interested in Daoism because they want to learn this ancient Daoist wisdom, but activate it in kind of a modern Western sense, if that makes sense. So let's take a look at some actual American Daoist masters. These are not pop culture figures. This is a wide variety of people. Some are living, some are dead. I think I've personally interviewed all of the living figures. And what do they all have in common? Okay, what do they all have in common? These are all people who are, some of them are Chinese immigrants to America. Ni Huaqing and Xie Lu, Jiafu Feng were Chinese people who immigrated to America, taught Daoist techniques. Alex Anatol was Russian, but he opened a Daoist temple and training center in Boston in the 80s or 90s. We talked about John Blofeld earlier. He was the British writer, right? Osho was an Indian man who kind of combined, who used a lot of Daoist ideas in his kind of very eclectic theology he used Zen and yoga, but a lot of Daoism as well. Alan Watts, another popular writer, and so forth. So what do they all have in common? They all might be considered American Daoist masters, and they would sort of see themselves as conserving the ancient wisdom of the East and passing it on to the West, right, through disciples. None of them are actually Daoshi. According to traditional Daoism in China, none of them have Daoist initiation or ordination. They're not priests or monks, right? And one more thing that I think they all have in common, maybe you're noticing it right now, they all have cool beards, right? They all have cool beards. So again, that suggests that being an American Daoist master is kind of a performance. It's a role that you play, right? It's a role that you play. All right, how are we doing on time? I mean, I could go on forever, but I want to get a lot of discussion for people getting bored.
I think we're okay.
Okay, so let me take a few more minutes here. So let me give you a couple of historical examples. And again, remember, I'm a historian of American religion, so let me give you a couple of like little vignettes of American Daoism in action, so you can see kind of how it works on the ground level. So the first thread I want to talk about, the first historical thread, is Esalen and the human potential movement. Okay, the human potential movement really helped develop a basic Daoist, kind of Daoist in quotes, vocabulary in America. Words like Tao itself, words like Qi and Yin Yang, really found a home in the human potential movement. The human potential movement is kind of a generic name for a whole range of therapeutic techniques based on self-transformation, and it helped, it popularized the Tao Te Ching, the Yi Jing, the practice of Tai Chi. Alan Watts, again, who's a British writer who wrote a lot about Buddhism, kind of popularized Buddhism in the West. But his final book before he died in 1973 was about Taoism, Tao, the Watercourse Way. Al Huang and Jiafu Feng both worked at Esalen, and Alan Watts gave a lot of seminars there. They both taught Tai Chi there. Jiafu Feng did a very influential translation of the Tao Te Ching. And so this is really one stream of American Daoism, where you have masters, and again, some of them may be Chinese immigrants. This guy was a British immigrant, but they kind of popularized Daoist ideas and Daoist techniques. What's interesting is that Esalen has been called by the historian of religion Jeff Kripal the religion of no religion, right? Because it's really based on the human potential movement in some ways is founded on the rejection of authority, the rejection of any kind of spiritual authority or religious authority other than like your kind of your personal authenticity. Chinese Daoism, in the course of history, repeatedly created structures of authority, right? They're gods, as we saw, they're masters, they're authoritative texts. So it's interesting that idea came through Esalen, and of course, it got changed completely. Some would say almost reversed. Let me give you another quick historical vignette about American Daoism. And this is the Taoist Sanctuary, which started in the early 1970s in North Hollywood, California. Not the glamorous Hollywood you're thinking. North Hollywood is in the San Fernando Valley. It's kind of a land of strip malls and so forth, and you can kind of see one here. The Taoist Sanctuary is interesting because, as far as I could tell, it is the first self-identified Taoist religious organization officially recognized as a tax-exempt religion in America. It applied for tax-exempt status as a religious organization and as a Taoist organization. So this was in the early 70s in the suburbs of Los Angeles, California. And it taught the usual range of things. It taught Tao Te Ching study, I Ching study, Tai Chi, martial arts, right? And even some kind of invented Taoist rituals. Some of its teachers were Chinese immigrants from mainland China who landed in LA and taught martial arts, for example. The leader and founder of the Taoist Sanctuary, who wrote several books on the I Ching and he made up some Taoist rituals, was this man, Kai Di, right? 1910 to 1991. What's really interesting, but what I think fits into my thesis very well, is that Kai Di was not Chinese at all, right? His birth name was Kenneth Dickerson, and he was born in New Jersey of kind of Anglo-Egyptian background. He was an actor, though, in LA, and he often played kind of the Chinese villain on TV because he kind of looked vaguely Asian. So he played Wo Fat on the original Hawaii Five-0, for example. And he didn't pretend to be Chinese. He wasn't lying or anything, but I think he allowed people to think, because he changed his name to Kai Di, that he had kind of East Asian origins. Let me do one more case study, and this is the last case study I want to talk about is Mantak Chia and the Healing Tao. There's a lot of biographical information about him. Very briefly, Mantak Chia is a Thai-born Chinese man. He was trained in Hong Kong, actually. He has a background in both Chinese and Western medicine, and traditional Taoist practices. According to his own narrative, his most influential teacher was a Taoist hermit who lived in the hills behind a temple in Hong Kong, right? But he never really tells you what hill or what temple, I think, right? But he called this teacher Young, I think, Young, One Cloud, right? And One Cloud gave Mantak Chia a mandate to teach the 9 formulas of immortality, basically a system of Neidan, a system of inner alchemy. Chia systemized these various teachings he has received, and in 1974, when he was a young man in Bangkok, he opened a clinic called the Natural Healing Center. In 1978, he moved to New York City, and he posted advertisements teaching that he could help people open their microcosmic orbit, their, how do you say that in Chinese? Their Shao Tian, microcosmic orbit, or a money-back guarantee. And he opened his own healing center, which is interesting. And the language here is so interesting. So in Bangkok, his center was called the Natural Healing Center. His first center in New York City was called the Daoist Esoteric Yoga Center. So kind of hitting on all the hot spots: Taoism, esotericism, yoga, all the things that were popular kind of in that countercultural milieu in the late 70s on the East Coast. And then in the early 80s, the name changed to the Healing Tao Center, which is what it's still called today. Healing Tao became one of the most widespread institutional forms of American Taoism. And his first book, and basically it taught a kind of systematized view of Chinese, of Neidan, based on meridians and acupuncture spots, right? So this is a kind of chart, a typical chart from his book. His first book, I think, was published in '83. It was called Awaken Healing Energy Through Tao. But it was really his second book that kind of made his name. So see if you can figure out the difference between the title of his first book and the title of his second book, and think why his second book made him very, very popular, right? So his second book, Taoist Secrets of Love, Cultivating Male Sexual Energy. So you've got male, you've got sexual, you've got love, you've got secrets, you've got things that will really tantalize a Western audience, right? What's really interesting to me is that in the biographical notes in Mantak Chia's early books, it states that the Mantak Chia himself is a Christian, but has used traditional Taoist methods to help thousands of people heal or improve themselves. And any mention to Chia's Christianity was later dropped, right? You don't hear that anymore. What's also interesting is his author photo. In his earlier books, the little author's photo, this is Mantak Chia here, right? Maybe it's his immigration photo, but, very kind of you could argue this looks like a Christian, Chinese from the Bangkok Chinese community, looks kind of typical. But later, more current pictures of Mantak Chia, and he looks like this, right? So again, this is the idea that he learned how to become an American Taoist master. It was a role that was prepared for him by his students who had grown up watching TV shows and movies featuring the Oriental monk. And then when Mantak Chia came to the US as an immigrant, he kind of had it took him several years to kind of step into this role, to go from this to this, which is kind of what he still looks like today. He's still operating today. Mantak Chia's most famous student is a man named Michael Wynn, and there is him meditating at the Ascension Point in Loguantai, west of Xi'an, supposedly where Lao Tzu ascended. And he leads tours of dream trippers. Now, this is the subject of a book that David and I wrote, so that's a talk for another time, or just buy the book or download it in Chinese. But I want to end with these quotes that take us back to Edward Said and the extreme Orientalism, the extreme idea of conservation, that it is up to us Americans to conserve the essence of Chinese mystical teachings, right? And these are quotes that David and I collected in our years of doing research with people who Michael Wynn, Americans mostly, some Canadians, Europeans, other Westerners, who he takes on these tours of Taoist hotspots in China, right? And we asked them what they thought, and these were just some of the most prominent quotes, right? Which is just kind of Orientalism, writ large. So again, this is a good place to end. So here's my email. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions. This is the cover of our book, which came out 8 years ago, which deals with these dream trips, and it's kind of Orientalism and many other things as well. And this is the Chinese cover of the Chinese version, and this is the QR code to download for free the Chinese version. So again, I really want to get a lot of questions and discussions going. So thank you guys for sticking with me.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Elijah. So we'll start off with questions. Anybody have any questions? And those online, please don't hesitate to raise your hand or to type in some question in the comments.